Chapter 9 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 9. Final. It is a dangerous thing to see anything in the sphere of a vain blusterer before the vain blusterer sees it himself. Mr. Bounderby felt that Mrs. Sparsit had audaciously anticipated him, and presumed to be wiser than he. He turned this presumption, on the part of a woman in her dependent position, over and over in his mind, until it accumulated with turning, like a great snowball. At last he made the discovery that to discharge this highly connected female, to have it in his power to say,
"She was a woman of family, and wanted to stick to me, but I wouldn't have it, and I got rid of her,"
would be to get the utmost possible amount of crowning glory out of the connection, and at the same time to punish Mrs. Sparsit according to her deserts. Filled fuller than ever with this great idea, Mr. Bounderby came in to lunch, and sat himself down in the dining-room of former days, where his portrait was. Mrs. Sparsit sat by the fire, with her foot in her cotton stirrup, little thinking whither she was posting. Since the Pegler affair, this gentlewoman had covered her pity for Mr. Bounderby with a veil of quiet melancholy and contrition. In virtue thereof, it had become her habit to assume a woeful look, which woeful look she now bestowed upon her patron.
"What's the matter now, ma'am?"
said Mr. Bounderby, in a very short, rough way.
"Pray, sir,"
returned Mrs. Sparsit,
"do not bite my nose off."
"Bite your nose off, ma'am?
repeated Mr. Bounderby,
Your nose?"
meaning, as Mrs. Sparsit conceived, that it was too developed a nose for the purpose; after which offensive implication he cut himself a crust of bread, and threw the knife down with a noise. Mrs. Sparsit took her foot out of her stirrup, and said,
"Mr. Bounderby, sir?"
"Well, ma'am,
retorted Mr. Bounderby.
what you staring at?"
"May I ask, sir,
said Mrs. Sparsit.
have you been ruffled this morning?"
"Yes, ma'am."
"May I inquire, sir,"
pursued the injured woman,
"whether I am the unfortunate cause of your having lost your temper?"
"Now, I'll tell you what, ma'am.
said Bounderby.
I am not come here to be bullied. A female may be highly connected, but she can't be permitted to bother and badger a man in my position, and I am not going to put up with it."
Mr. Bounderby felt it necessary to get on, foreseeing that if he allowed of details he would be beaten. Mrs. Sparsit first elevated, then knitted her Coriolanian eyebrows, gathered up her work into its proper basket, and rose.
"Sir,"
said she, majestically,
"it is apparent to me that I am in your way at present. I will retire to my own apartment."
"Allow me to open the door, ma'am."
"Thank you, sir. I can do it for myself."
"You had better allow me, ma'am,"
said Bounderby, passing her and getting his hand upon the lock,
"because I can take the opportunity of saying a word to you before you go, Mrs. Sparsit, ma'am. I rather think you are cramped here, d'ye know. It appears to me that, under my humble roof, there's hardly opening enough for a lady of your genius in other people's affairs."
Mrs. Sparsit gave him a look of the darkest scorn, and said, with great politeness,
"Really, sir?"
"I have been thinking it over, you see, since the late affairs have happened, ma'am,
said Bounderby,
and it appears, to my poor judgment—"
"Oh, pray, sir,"
Mrs. Sparsit interposed, with sprightly cheerfulness,
"don't disparage your judgment. Everybody knows how unerring Mr. Bounderby's judgment is. Everybody has had proofs of it. It must be the theme of general conversation. disparage anything in yourself but your judgment, sir,"
said Mrs. Sparsit, laughing. Mr. Bounderby, very red and uncomfortable, resumed.
"It appears to me, ma'am, I say, that a different sort of establishment altogether would bring out a lady of your powers. Such as an establishment as your relations, Lady Scadger's, now. Don't you think you might find some affairs there, ma'am, to interfere with?"
"It never occurred to me before, sir,"
returned Mrs. Sparsit.
"but now you mention it, should think it highly probable."
"Then supposing you try, ma'am,"
said Bounderby, laying an envelope with a cheque in it in her little basket.
"you can take your own time for going, ma'am, but perhaps in the meanwhile it will be more agreeable to a lady of your powers of mind to eat her meals by herself, and not to be intruded upon. I really ought to apologise to you, being only Josiah Bounderby of Coketown, for having stood in your light so long."
"Pray don't name it, sir."
returned Mrs. Sparsit.
"If that portrait could speak, sir. But it has the advantage over the original of not possessing the power of committing itself and disgusting others. It would testify that a long period has elapsed since I first habitually addressed it as the picture of a noodle. Nothing that a noodle does can awaken surprise or indignation. The proceedings of a noodle can only inspire contempt."
Thus saying, Mrs. Sparsit, with her Roman features like a medal struck to commemorate her scorn of Mr. Bounderby, surveyed him fixedly from head to foot, swept disdainfully past him, and ascended the staircase. Mr. Bounderby closed the door, and stood before the fire, projecting himself, after his old explosive manner, into his portrait, and into futurity. Into how much of futurity? He saw Mrs. Sparsit fighting out a daily fight at the points of all the weapons in the female armoury, with the grudging, smarting, peevish, tormenting Lady Scadgers, still laid up in bed with her mysterious leg, and gobbling her insufficient income down by about the middle of every quarter, in a mean little airless lodging, a mere closet for one, a mere crib for two. But did he see more? Did he catch any glimpse of himself making a show of Bitzer to strangers, as the rising young man, so devoted to his master's great merits, who had won young Tom's place, and had almost captured young Tom himself, in the times when by various rascals he was spirited away? Did he see any faint reflection of his own image making a vain glorious will, whereby 25 humbugs, past 55 years of age, each taking upon himself the name Josiah Bounderby of Coketown, should for ever dine in Bounderby Hall, for ever lodge in Bounderby Buildings, for ever attend a Bounderby chapel, for ever go to sleep under a Bounderby chaplain, for ever be supported out of a Bounderby estate, and for ever nauseate all healthy stomachs with a vast amount of Bounderby balderdash and bluster? Had he any prescience of the day, 5 years to come, when Josiah Bounderby of Coketown was to die of a fit in the Coketown street, and this same precious will was to begin its long career of quibble, plunder, false pretences, vile example, little service, and much law? Probably not. Yet the portrait was to see it all out. Here was Mr. Gradgrind, on the same day and in the same hour, sitting thoughtful in his own room. How much of futurity did he see? Did he see himself a white-haired, decrepit man, bending his hitherto inflexible theories to appointed circumstances, making his facts and figures subservient to faith, hope, and charity, and no longer trying to grind that heavenly trio in his dusty little mills? Did he catch sight of himself, therefore, much despised by his late political associates? Did he see them, in the era of its being quite settled that the national dustmen have only to do with one another, and owe no duty to an abstraction called a people, taunting the honourable gentleman with this and with that and with what not, 5 nights a week, until the small hours of the morning? Probably he had that much foreknowledge, knowing his men. Here was Louisa, on the night of the same day, watching the fire as in days of yore, though with a gentler and a humbler face. How much of the future might arise before her vision! Broadsides in the streets, signed with her father's name, exonerating the late Stephen Blackpool, weaver, from misplaced suspicion, and publishing the guilt of his own son, with such extenuation as his years and temptation, he could not bring himself to add his education, might beseech, were of the present. So Stephen Blackpool's tombstone, with her father's record of his death, was almost of the present, for she knew it was to be. These things she could plainly see. But how much of the future? A working woman christened Rachel, after a long illness, once again appearing at the ringing of the factory bell, and passing to and fro at the set hours among the Coctan hands. A woman of pensive beauty, always dressed in black, but sweet-tempered and serene, and even cheerful, who, of all the people in the place, alone appeared to have compassion on a degraded drunken wretch of her own sex, who was sometimes seen in the town secretly begging of her, and crying to her. A woman working, ever working, but content to do it, and preferring to do it as her natural lot until she should be too old to labor any more. Did Louisa see this? Such a thing was to be. A lonely brother, many thousands of miles away, writing, on paper blotted with tears, that her words had too soon come true, and that all the treasures in the world would be cheaply bartered for a sight of her dear face. At length this brother coming nearer home, with hope of seeing her, and being delayed by illness. And then a letter, in a strange hand, saying, he died in hospital of fever such a day, and died in penitence and love of you, his last word being your name. Did Louisa see these things? Such things were to be. End of Chapter 9. End of Book 3. End of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens.